Good evening, everybody. It's I, Nick, Pennsylvania, here as always with my good friend Brendan Bond. How are you this evening, Brendan?
I'm doing excellent, Nick. How are you?
I'm real good, and I'm actually really excited as well because I'll tell you a brief story. Many years ago when I was very young, I went to the library for what is the first time I remember going to a library. I may likely have been in one before, but I remember this event because I was fascinated by dinosaurs and a certain someone about whom we are going to speak this evening. And I got 2 books from the library, and I had them for at least 15 more years because we then promptly moved and never returned those 2 books. And I felt immense guilt about that for a long time.
I'm sure the statute of limitations is worn out by now.
I think so. And I'm looking over at my bookshelf with all of my books, and I'm in the library right now, and I do not have those books any longer, but yes, so this is a subject we're going to be discussing tonight, which goes back to some of my earliest memories of having any sort of interest in this sort of subject. So tell us, what are you here to talk with us about tonight?
So tonight we are going to talk about, in my mind, what is certainly one of the members of the Mount Rushmore of cryptids, and that is Nessie, the Loch Ness monster. So I think a lot of people, when they first hear about cryptids or think about cryptids, like I said, Nessie, I think, is one of the first ones people think of. It's it's ingrained in a lot of pop culture, and it's been around for a long time in the stories and in the folklore. It's like I said, it's right there with I think Loch Ness monster, Bigfoot, Chupacabra, and people often
I was going to say a gray.
A gray alien. Yeah.
There's your Mount Rushmore. There's all 4.
Right. I would say that the honorable mention has to probably be Mothman. That's probably the next. He's
as much I might put that about Chupacabra. Maybe I think that
at
least in the Anglophone world here.
Right. Yeah, we have to remember there's a lot of other folks out there, I think, that would probably say Chupacabra is number 1. The reason why is those different monsters, if you will, or cryptids, are kind of people's first introduction into this whole paranormal, folklore, historical realm, because it is the first thing that when you're growing up and when you're young, that there are stories and there's monsters and stories.
And it's the first books you steal from the library.
Everyone I know that is like-minded with us remember seeing those books in the library when we were young. It was always Bigfoot and Chupacabra and the Loch Ness monster. And when you see those photos, you're like, oh wait, are monsters real? So I think the Loch Ness monster is something that doesn't need a lot of initial introduction. And it's also something that has a storied history of people, I think, openly being like, oh, well, that's not real. It's just a story. And people kind of pass it off and everything. And it's used as an example of these things being fake or whatever. There's something that's happening. Well, it just happened this last weekend. I think is a great example of the counter argument to that, that's saying, well, there's a lot of people that, report these things, and maybe we should look into them. And we talk about that a lot with ghost hunting, that even if we don't agree with the methods, if we don't agree with the methods and we don't agree with some of the theories, I do think that it is good work to be doing, in the sense
Well, the one thing I'll say to that too is you would figure with the Loch Ness monster, we have I've never heard of an interdimensional aspect to the Loch Ness monster. I've never heard the Nessie apologists come out with that. It seems to me that the tools and the methodology, or at least the tools for which to identify whether there's a large aquatic beast and a closed lake, would be much less disputable than some of the conversation and arguments we've had within the ghost hunting realm.
Right. And I think that's what makes Nessie so accessible to folks as like maybe there is more, because it is on the far end of that spectrum that we talk about of things being quote unquote flesh and blood. So I think it's a good kind of like stepping stone into this world, because you're right. Most, granted, I'm sure there are stories out there, and I'm sure there are people who have theories about Loch Ness Monster that are much more paranormal. But I agree that most folks, I think generally speaking, think that, okay, if there is an animal, it is a physical animal of some sort. And then that just kind of leads to the question, okay, well, if it is a physical animal, what is it? And that's where the mystery kind of comes
in. I agree with all of that.
So what's happening this past weekend? They haven't released any results yet. I'm sure there will be some either by the time this episode comes out or shortly after. But what's happening is there are two groups getting together: the Loch Ness Center and the Loch Ness Exploration Group, which are located in the Scottish Highlands at Loch Ness. These groups have both been around for a while. They have great websites that I was on, and the thing that I really liked about both of them that I'll just say real quick is they seem to take the story of the Loch Ness Monster and kind of run that thing down the middle, where it's like, yes, there is a creature we're looking for, we're interested in that element of it, but also there's just this celebration of the folklore and the history of the loch as a whole, and the communities around it, and the people, and it's just good vibes. I think taking a very healthy approach to the whole thing. But basically,
a holistic approach, it sounds like.
Yes. Yeah, very holistic. And what this is this search apparently is going to be the largest one that's been conducted in 50 years. And when I saw that, I was like, oh. Because in my mind, like, people are always looking for Loch Ness. So what makes this one so different? Because as we know, the loch is huge. It takes up about 22 square miles and has a maximum depth I found of 788 feet.
Which is deep. Really surprising. Yeah, because I don't believe Lake Erie, the Great Lake immediately to our north, gets that deep. I'm going to take a look at that. Of course, Lake Erie is the shallowest of all the Great Lakes, but even then, 700 some feet, that's mighty deep. Do you know of how this loch was formed?
This is a glacial loch, from what I understand. So it was kind of cut by the glaciers initially and then eroded from there. So, and the loch has been there as long as people have been there, kind of thing. It's not because I think over here in America, when we think of lochs, we think of dams. When we say loch as in Loch Ness, we mean like lake.
Right, the Scottish vernacular.
The Scottish,
so,
yeah.
Real quick, just because I looked it up, the average depth of Lake Erie is only 62 feet. The deepest part is 210 feet. Right,
so significantly shallower than Loch Ness. So we have a lake that is 22 square miles and is that deep. It does invite a little bit of speculation to what might be down there, because there's a lot of room for things to hide, and with all the geologic artifacts, there's places to hide, there's caves, there's not a whole lot known about the bottom of the lake. So what these two groups are doing is they're getting folks together, and they're doing a few things. They are doing sonar, looking for what they call targets. Then they are using hydrophones, which I think are fascinating, which is basically a microphone you put in the water and listen to things to try and collect any kind of anomalous information that they can. And also they have 16 locations around the loch, which they have people gathered on the surface, specifically just watching in both historically relevant hotspots, but also I think probably some of them are probably just places where a lot of folks can get together with binoculars and watch the water.
By the way, I was crunching the numbers. That's a depth of 88 3/4 Shaquille O'Neals on average, I guess. Oh, no. I'm just trying to put that into perspective.
Yeah, right.
And come to terms with, yeah.
But so I mean, it's a big lake, and they're having a lot of people look at it this weekend. And when I heard that again, I was just like, oh, that's really cool. I'm glad people are doing that. And, it's a good excuse to get together and just be outside with like-minded people, partly. But also it's like, well, you get that many people looking and maybe they're going to find something.
Yeah, I like this approach. I feel though, I'm almost certain that, well, one, it was cited that this is going to be the biggest hunt in 50 years. Obviously, a lot has changed in our understanding in the development and technology, what we have to search with in these waters. But I feel as though a massive searcher survey for any large aquatic animal living in the loch is conducted at least once a generation, because I seem to remember either in the early aughts or the mid late 90s that another such survey was conducted. And
You're
if I
thinking
remember
about, yeah,
correctly, they
you're
were
thinking
kind of
about
talking.
You're thinking about Operation Deep Scan,
Okay.
which was in '87, and
Oh, a little earlier than I
yeah, but
realized.
that's the one all of us I think remember when we think of like the Monster Quest episodes and just
Yeah,
like
because I
it's on
remember they
search
had
of.
radar and everything, sonar.
Right. Right. And that was 24 boats equipped with echo sounding equipment that were deployed in the loch. And that one, Operation Deep Scan, had like BBC scientists on it. Like it really was like a legit scientific study.
Yeah, I
Um,
remember it being a BBC production. Now I remember. And what did that yield anything?
what that did, they did have a few sonar hits that indicated like there was a lot of, I guess, a lot more like debris on the bottom of the loch than what they initially anticipated. And there also was a few photos that were taken in that one that were kind of inconclusive, like a lot of them are. But that one did have a few echo sonar hits that, were hard to explain in conventional means. Specifically, the quote from one of the main scientists was, "There's something here that we don't understand, and there's something here that is larger than a fish. Maybe some species that hasn't been detected before. I don't know." And I love whenever
Well,
scientists just say, "I don't know," because that's the truth a lot of times.
well, and that leaves the door open. One of the things when you gave the names of the two groups that are coming together,
Hmm.
my suspicion would be that if they find anything that leaves any door open, they're either going to leap on that, or what happens if they find, like, conclusively there is nothing here. I imagine it's going to go into two camps of full believers, either that there was certainly something that's no longer, or we're going to
Hmm.
start hearing talk of interdimensional Nessie.
Right, right. Well, yeah, and that's kind of the problem is it's hard to prove a negative. You know, like
Well,
unless
right. That's
like it's very hard. Like all you can do is prove that you didn't find anything. It doesn't prove there's nothing there, and that's where like bias comes into the questioning. You know,
I don't know. I think this gets into that whole aspect of the burden of proof and whatnot. No,
right?
you can't prove a negative per se, but there's that whole line that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Well,
Right.
isn't that like the scientific method though?
Right. Well, and that
I
gets
mean, I
into
can see it either way, honestly, with regard to that.
right.
And I mean, and it's true though. Just because, even if we conclusively find that there is nothing there now, that does not mean that there wasn't something
Correct.
before. And
You're
I
right.
can honestly imagine, because I'm sure you've heard, and
Hmm.
I'm sorry if I'm jumping on something that you have in your notes that you prepared for the day, but I'm sure you've heard people theorize that, well, perhaps this is a coelacanth. Well, how to get a remnant
Hmm.
of coelacanths that became stuck in there. I'm not sure I buy that, but we do know that coelacanths were thought to be extinct, and we've at
Hmm.
least dredged a couple up in the last 50, 60 years. So
Right.
that doesn't mean that it couldn't have been something like that, but it is long since deceased.
Right. Like so that kind of gets into like the misidentification idea as far as what this might be. The weirder stuff is like what you mentioned, a coelacanth, or I mean, the big thing is a plesiosaur, which is like the finned, long-necked dinosaur. It was an aquatic reptile. There was a few different versions of them, And that's the one I think most people think of whenever they think of like the famous pictures throughout history and some of the later stories. What I think people don't realize is a lot of the early stories are really are a lot weirder than what people, I think, remember.
Am I wrong in saying one of the earliest, if not the earliest, description of some sort of beast was when a saint
Yeah,
came to the lake?
so Saint Columbia, yes. That is a story from I think 15 or not 15, 565 AD. So one of the earliest reports of this monster in the vicinity of Loch Ness appears in the life of Saint Columbia. This was written in the 6th century AD, and it was written. This Irish monk, Saint Columbia, was staying in the land of the Picts, Picts, which historically I'm not familiar with.
Well, yeah, there were the Picts, the Gaels, the
Oh,
Gauls.
okay.
Yeah, the Saxons and the Anglos. These are all like the ethnic tribal peoples
Mm-hmm.
that occupy the British Isles. I'm
Yes.
sure I'm forgetting quite a few.
So we have this monk there, who's there with his companions, and they encountered local residents who were burying a man right next to the river. And they explained that the man was attacked in the water and mauled and was killed, which was, they were like, oh, that's kind of crazy, obviously. So Columbia sent a follower. I'm not going to pronounce this name.
Don't even try. Just say the funniest way you can do it. People can look it up.
Lugene Maku. Lugene Moku. Again, I'm so far
Eugene McDaniels. Okay.
So it was a follower of his that he had the man swim across the loch, and apparently the beast approached him, showed itself, but the Saint Columbia made the sign of the cross and said, "Go no further. Do not touch the man. Go back at once." And the creature stopped and did not touch the follower. And this was put down as basically a miracle that this monk, then future saint, apparently did. So
I wonder if this wasn't one of the miracles for which she was beatified.
Yeah, and that's like, from what I can find, that's like the earliest like monster in the lake kind of thing. There's just a lot of folklore, it seems like, around this monster in the centuries to follow. And a lot of the stuff you find there is almost identical to a lot of the other Scottish and Gaelic stories about kelpies or water horses. Really, the stories are very interchangeable. It's basically a fish or an eel with a horse-like head that is pseudo-fae, kind of in that realm. So that's more the paranormal stuff than what we see later. You have some other sightings that start to come up and be documented a little bit better in the 1800s. Then you start to get more, I would say, more modern ones. One was a man named Alexander MacDonald in the late 1800s that reported a large, stubby-legged animal that surfaced from the loch and propelled itself within 50 yards of the shore. And he said that the creature looked more like a salamander than anything else. So significantly different than like a water horse.
I have to admit, I've never even heard of the water horse.
Oh, really?
Okay, yeah, well, you're gonna have to get me wise, because I imagine that others are unfamiliar as well.
Yeah, So we'll have to do a whole episode on kelpies then at some point here. That'll be fun. But basically, the kind of long and short of it: pseudo-fae creature, eel-like body, with like a horse-type head, and you see them showing up in bodies of water all over Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales, in folklore. It seems like for a period of time you couldn't throw a rock into a body of water without there apparently being a kelpie story around it. So we'll do a deep dive into that, because I'm sure there's things about it that I don't know.
Sounds good.
But then in 1933 is where we start to see, it was kind of what I think of like as the beginning of the modern era, because that's where you have a lot of the early sightings that we have really good documentation and quotes from
Of course, the
really
first real good photos too. In
right, exactly,
particular.
yeah. That's we have those early sketches and those early
That one
photographs.
neck photo that was on the
Yes,
cover of one of the books that I'm feeling more and more guilty about as the
right.
evening goes on.
And that's where we start to see the long neck dinosaur stuff kind of come out. So let me go over some of these early sightings, because there was one that I found written down that I completely kind of unlocked a memory. I remember reading about it probably in one of those books and thinking how crazy it was. There was a gentleman, well, gentleman or lady, I'm not sure. Aldie, Aldie. What they saw was they reported in a newspaper they saw a large beast or whale-like fish. And this was in April of 1913. They were driving along the road, and the quote is, "The creature disported itself, rolling and plunging for fully a minute. Its body resembled that of a whale, and the water cascading and churning like a simmering cauldron." I love this language. Soon, however, it disappeared in a boiling mass of foam. Both onlookers confessed that there was something uncanny about the whole thing, for they realized that there was no ordinary denizen of the depths, because apart from its enormous size, the beast, in taking the final plunge, sent out waves that were big enough to have been caused by a passing steamer.
Good alliteration with that denizen of the depth.
Denizen of the depths. I'd read that book. I'd watch that movie. I'd go see that band. This next one, I remember specifically being covered in the show In Search Of. So in July of 1933, same year, George Spicer and his wife saw a road crossing of this animal. They described the creature as having a large body, 8 meters long, having a long, wavy, narrow neck, but they saw no limbs. It lurched across the road and leaving a trail of broken undergrowth in its wake as it moved back to the water. Spicer described it as a dragon or prehistoric animal. Oh, it had an animal in its mouth, apparently. So this was like on the land hunting or something. It says it was fairly big with a high back, and if there were any feet, it must have been of a webbed sort, he said. So this one sounds much more like a dinosaur and not much like a salamander or a whale or a water horse. Then also in 1933, this is where Hugh Gray's photograph was taken in November of 1933. It was the first photograph that apparently depicted the monster. It was slightly blurry. Oh, Gray had taken his Labrador for a walk, and it is suspected that the photograph depicts the dog fetching a stick from the loch. So even though that was a very famous first photograph, it was immediately kind of, maybe not debunked. People were like, oh, that's definitely a dog, or that's definitely an otter, something along those lines. Okay. The next year, in 1934, this is the famous what's called surgeon's photograph. This is the one we're all thinking of the long-necked, kind of black and white Nessie in the waves. And for a long time, that one was considered, proof by a lot of folks. People also immediately were like, that's definitely just driftwood or an otter or a bird, something along those lines. And it was later kind of proved that the photo was, a hoax, which is, kind of a bummer. It is what it is. Like the guy definitely faked it. But that was the first one that really stirred up, I think, a lot of talk and a lot of, original folklore around the monster. Early on in the history of Nessie, we have obvious hoaxes happening. But that doesn't seem to be deterring people, because even early on in 1934, that was one of the first expeditions. There was a gentleman named Edward Mountain who led, from what I can tell, the first legit expedition to search the loch. And that one was there was about 20 men positioned themselves with binoculars and cameras around the loch for 6 weeks. Excuse me, 5 weeks, starting in July of 1934. There was a lot of photographs taken, but nothing was considered conclusive. But, we have these organized searches happening early, and I think that speaks to how popular it was and how, even though there was, these hoaxes happening, people still thought something was going on. when I first when I first started to look into this, one of the things you think about is like, okay, well, if people always thought this was a hoax, why do people still keep caring about it? You know, and
Sure.
and on one of the websites, I can't remember which one it was, either for the Loch Ness Center or for the exploration group, they reported that there's over 1,000 official, like, documented Nessie sightings, which is a lot. Like, if we're talking documented as in like reported to one of these groups or from like one of the expeditions or from one of these searches,
Yeah.
um, that's a lot of evidence. I mean, obviously, it's the vast majority of it, I'm sure, is anecdotal, but enough people are seeing things that are confusing to them that it warrants all of this, kind of extra work. So I think that's interesting. That kind of stuff started early. During some of these expeditions, like we mentioned earlier, with like Operation Deep Scan, they get hits and everything that are interesting. There's two photos. One is often referred to as the Muppet photo, which is just I'm sure you've seen, it's just the neck kind of sticking out of the water.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
it's
So
I
like
think
a sock puppet almost.
it almost looks like a sock puppet. Yeah, it's I think one of the first good color photographs. Again, as someone who wants to believe, it doesn't look great. You know,
Well,
um,
wasn't that one determined to be a toy boat that had something on it?
there was another one. Yes.
Because the two I remember most is the neck coming up, the very dinosaur like one, and
Yes.
I feel that that one was pretty thoroughly debunked, although I could be mistaken.
Yes.
And another one has like the ripples, and it shows like a tail almost like.
Right. The Muppet one, it was again from a guy named Anthony Doc Shells, and that was the one with the ripples where they were like, because of how the water looks in the photograph, the scale has to be way off. So like it can't be the size that he says it is. It has to be something smaller.
Oh yes,
Um,
I'm looking at the Muppet photo right now, and
mhm.
it does kind of look like almost like a Godzilla head.
Right.
And it seems like, again, you can look, if you type in Loch Ness Muppet, it'll pop
It'll
right up.
come right up. Yeah.
And the one other thing that I think is weird, you say it doesn't look good. The other thing I notice is the fact that the water doesn't seem to be really disturbed around it either.
Right. It doesn't look like a large animal in the water. It just
It
does. It just
suggests to me that if it were a large animal in the wild, it would have just stood or swam, just kind of treaded water in that position for some time.
right. Yeah, it just doesn't pass the eye test. So it's just it's a little different. The one you're talking about with the humps earlier, that was taken by Peter McNabb in 1955, and that's the one where, if you see it, how that one has been kind of debunked is they are supposed to be an example of rogue waves on the loch, because the loch is big enough that rogue waves happen with this weird, like, triangular, basically when you have like converging winds, you basically get like a standing pyramid shaped wave, that moves very strangely compared to the water and wind around it, which is, like, again, a real thing that has like sank ocean liners and big boats and stuff like that. It's
Right. I've heard of rogue waves out on the ocean and whatnot, and they're a pretty mysterious thing. And it's my understanding that for a long time they were kind of hotly contested about whether they were a real thing or not. I feel as though that has been settled and that they do occur. We have video evidence. It's pretty, and we have a history of going back, and we found some mechanism by which they occur. When you initially said rogue wave on the lock, I'm still a little bit on edge about subscribing to that without
Mhm.
anything pretty firm, because again, we live so close to the Great Lakes, which are
Right.
worlds larger than Loch Ness. And I've never heard of I'm staring at a book of Great Lake shipwrecks. I've never heard of a rogue wave upon one of the Great Lakes. I've
Right.
only ever heard that with regard to the oceans.
That's an excellent point. It's one of those things where it's kind of like, it could be a rogue wave, but again, you're it's like when people use ball lightning as an excuse for UFOs. It's like,
Right.
It's like
That's
such a rare, not understood phenomena. Only might exist, like it's so you're using one mystery to solve another mystery, which maybe the
usually
case.
not a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, just generally not a great idea. It might be true, but it's not a great look. Now, as far as like other evidence though, that is a little more interesting. Besides some of the sonar hit stuff, because the sonar hit stuff is interesting in a lot of these searches. That's why I'm glad that these two groups are using sonar this weekend, because for folks, again, not being a sonar expert, it seems like folks who do know how to read sonar well can tell the difference between like a 30-foot creature and a 30-foot column of bubbles or something. Like if something is an anomalous hit, you can't say that, oh, that's definitely a Loch Ness monster. But if they're able to, in some of these instances, they're able to track large anomalous things for, a long enough period of time that it's not just like a misreading or something like that. So when those people say, hey, that's something weird, doesn't necessarily mean it's the Loch Ness monster, but it's a professional saying it's something weird and unusual, which I think is something we have to kind of take into account with the number of reports we do have.
I will say, just kind of interrupting real quick on the subject of rogue waves, I did
Mm-hmm.
had a little sidebar over here. Apparently, and this is according to National Geographic as well as Atlas Obscura, apparently Lake Superior does have rogue waves. It has some other wave phenomenon, but rogue waves can form in large bodies of fresh water as well as the ocean. Of course, the Lake Superior, largest of the Great Lakes. They also get, I'm just reading this, abnormally
Mm-hmm.
large waves, colloquially known as the Three Sisters, because they appear to travel in a trio. Apparently, the largest recorded wave in the middle of the lake was just shy of 30 feet.
Jeez.
Yeah, which I don't know how many shacks that is, but I can find out really quickly for you. I'm going to do it. That is a 4.18 shacks,
Jeez.
according to my numbers here.
I mean, that's legit. That's
But
but
that's a
again,
lot of shack to handle. But
yeah.
again, I learned something, because I thought rogue waves were pretty exclusive to oceans, and apparently they really focused study and acceptance of them and study to
Mm-hmm.
determine how they occurred have only really begun in the mid 90s.
Right. Like there's stuff to learn still. And I think that's the important thing to remember.
Absolutely.
And so there's a lot of evidence out there, and I think that some of the better stuff on that aren't obvious hoaxes or proven to be hoaxes later. Like I said, some of the sonar stuff, some of the videos. I mean, there's like nowadays there are quite a few videos that have come out over the last few years, basically ever since like home videos have been more prevalent. Like you have some popular videos from the mid 2000s, and you have a lot actually in the early 2000s. And that I was able to kind of come across. And again, looking at them myself, I mean, we're on a podcast, I can't show them to you guys, but a lot of them are, looks weird, but like it's kind of really hard to tell. Now, one of the photographs, though, I believe was from the 77, or it was from the early 70s. Do you remember the picture of the fin from underwater? Have you seen that one before?
I have, yes.
Yeah, that's one of those ones. There's one with a fin and there's one with a neck, where it looks like a plesiosaur. Those ones, again, as a photographer, when I look at it, it's like, man, that I really want that to be a plesiosaur, but the odds of it being like just like driftwood or like logs or something, it could be roots. It's just so hard. It's so
Right.
Without the context, it's so hard to tell. But it's fascinating. You see it, you're like, it's like just enough to like hold on to.
Well, and our friend Heidi, who's pretty well versed in Celtic lore, as we've had her on here discussing it, when I told her this is what we were going to be discussing, she asked, was it a fancy log? I bet it was a log. Or rather, she said, well, she did ask if it was a fancy log. I told her, I haven't drawn any conclusions, but I hope they do. And they come forward with, we have discovered several very fancy logs lining the lake bed.
Well, as someone who appreciates trees a lot, like I mean, we've been together when I've stopped and be like, "That's a damn good tree over there." You know,
It's
you see
true.
it. You know, so
It's
like,
embarrassing when he does this in front of other people.
but but I mean, people are seeing something again. 1,000. You have all these. You have all of these reports and these sonar hits and all this again inconclusive, evidence, but evidence, data points. You mentioned earlier that it could be a plesiosaur. There's people who think, maybe it is some kind of landlocked animal like
Right.
a whale,
I don't believe it's a
manatee.
plesiosaur, but
Oh, I don't
all of
either.
these things.
Yeah, yeah.
And honestly, a manatee would almost be more remarkable to me than a plesiosaur as of some pod of family. But
Right.
I do want to say this though. I mean, the sonar, and I can only imagine, maybe not sonar itself, but the images that are broadcast back up are so much more exacting than what we even had during the 1987 one that you mentioned earlier. But
Yeah.
especially with the speed with which they come back, I would hope that second with sonar, like anytime anything anomalous is coming up, that they would be sending divers or cameras, underwater cameras down. Now I know too
ROVs, yeah.
that's besought with other issues because I remember distinctly watching dive teams in Loch Ness and they talk about like it is just not a very, even on the best days, there's
Right.
not the
It's
greatest visibility.
Right. It's not very conducive to searching like this.
But still, you would think like, oh, we have something anomalous. That to me is one of the frustrating things. You have something anomalous. You haven't confirmed what it is. All you are able to say is there's something large. That's it. Well, that's nothing to me.
Mm-hmm. And like some of the other things that people say it could be that, like, again, some of these we've talked about before, how big they can grow. We've talked about sturgeon before. Sturgeon
Which can live
we found out, yeah,
and get pretty big.
Yeah, and also as far as other fish go, you have Wells catfish, which can get gigantic, and also you have Greenland sharks that some people have talked about as possibly being in the loch.
Never heard of this.
Dude, Greenland sharks? Man, okay, sorry, I just got way too excited about
you did. You jumped through the screen at me.
Greenland sharks are awesome. So I'm just bringing up the Wikipedia real quick.
Also known as a Gurry shark.
Yeah, dude, they're huge. They live forever, basically, like sturgeon. According to Wikipedia, estimated between 250 and 500 years for some of these things.
Well, and they were very northernly located. Looking
they're
at
cold
their
water,
yeah,
with cold water.
But can they live in fresh water? I don't believe they can if they're a shark.
Not according to this. Not according to Wikipedia. But I mean, they just found a shark in Idaho. So
wow, apparently their flesh is poisonous and has a high urea content. Which, so like, what, you're gonna get gout?
But yeah, I mean, like it's a big creature, so that's one of the things people have talked about it possibly being. But again, that doesn't really. Again, you're replacing one mystery with another mystery, like how's it living there. I mean, like other natural things, you have just weird wakes, weird waves, just weird optical effects on the water. Since it is seismically active, there could be gas releasing underwater.
Oh, that's interesting.
That can do weird things.
That's an interesting aspect of it, the seismic activity. I wasn't aware of that, but it makes sense.
Right. There's a lot of weird things out there, but again, that's why I think it's important that these folks are doing this work, and I'm excited to see what, if anything, they find, because people are seeing something, and even if it is any of these things, whether it is seismic gas or weird waves or some other creature that we don't think is supposed to be there, there's still something we can learn about it. And if we have people out there looking and trying to actually find these things, we're going to learn more either way. And I think that's really the kind of crux of all this and why it's worth doing. And I'm so glad people are still doing it. And I don't know, if I was over there in Scotland, I would absolutely have been there this last weekend doing it. And, on their website, they said that they were taking volunteers, but they had to actually lock down the number of volunteers they had because they had so many people signing up for it. which, is a really cool thing. I mean, where I originally saw this article was on NPR, and then I found a BBC article. So it was international news that this was happening. So I mean, it still captures people's interest, one way or the other. I think that's the really cool thing about it.
One of the things that frustrates me, the true legacy of Loch Ness, though, in my estimation, is that because of Loch Ness, we are not allowed to have any sizable body of water that doesn't have some sort of creature living in it. And we've talked about this in the past. We know of man-made lakes where people claim that there's some sort of sea serpent or some sort of cryptid, and it's just bonkers. And the blame for that I lay at the feet of Loch Ness.